There are a lot of Superman origin stories, and some of them focus on different things. Some of them focus heavily on Krypton and getting, Kal-El off planet. Some of them focus more on Smallville and Clark Kent's upbringing. Some of them focus more on him striking out for himself for the first time and moving to Metropolis and beginning the Superman thing there. And Superman Birthright is, I would say, the latter of those types of origin stories. It kind of, it doesn't skip over Krypton, and in fact it cycles back to it in a really beautiful way as well. But it kind of assumes that you already have some basic knowledge of Superman's earliest origins and what he is and why he is, but it places you more in the shoes of a Clark Kent who doesn't know where he comes from yet, who doesn't know why he was sent here yet. And I really like that about this book because it allows Lex Luthor to really play with that too. Just like how the many different origin stories of Superman can focus on many different aspects of his life, which all happen to be true, but all are sort of a different focus for the character. You can also argue that's just Superman's character in general. Are you going to do a story that focuses on Lex Luthor and Metropolis? Are you going to do a story that focuses on the remaining Kryptonians and the Phantom Zone and Zod? Are you going to do a story which focuses on Brainiac or Mixel Bliss, whatever that guy's name is, or Superman's friends, which are visiting from the future? There's a ton of different story directions you can go with Superman. And Birthright, again, I've already mentioned, very much focuses on the whole Lex Luthor and Metropolis thing. But before any of that, we see that Clark Kent has been traveling the world, and we join up with him in Africa, and we see him kind of get inspired by this leadership figure, by this hero of his local community. And I thought that was really neat, because a lot of the time Superman will say like, oh, he's not necessarily American, he's obviously not from this world, and he wants to protect everyone on Earth, but also he is a very American-centric hero, and we rarely see him actually escape that. And to see him not do so just as Superman, but as Clark Kent himself is very rewarding. It feels very natural to see his thoughts develop from I need to hide what I am to I really wish I could just use what I am to help people, and then there's a situation where he actually does, and he is immediately aware of the fear with which people look at him when he showcases his abilities. And this is a running theme throughout the story. It's a parallel between him and Lex Luthor, and how the two characters react differently to that perception, that public perception of, things that people don't understand, I think is what defines each character. Because Superman sees people look at him with fear because he's just a man who can do these incredible things, and that's kind of scary, especially, not to mention, he's a white man who can do these things, and he's doing them in Africa, amongst a black community, and I don't have to really elaborate why that might be something that inspires fear. And over the course of this book, he realizes that, the narrative can be turned against him in Metropolis as well, and people will treat him with cynicism and fear if that is what people bend their will towards painting him as in, the media and stuff like that. And so what does the S symbol stand for? And Lex Luthor knows what it's like to be looked at with fear and suspicion, because he grew up as a genius, and his superior intellect constantly baffles his teachers. And honestly, my favorite section of this entire book was the flashback sequence in which we saw Clark Kent's friendship with Lex Luthor in Smallville. I've not watched the Smallville show, I know stuff like this has been adapted and done in other places, but this is my first time really seeing that aspect of the Superman lore, and it really is quite fascinating, and it was done so well here, because you can see that Clark is just trying to reach out to Lex and trying to establish a connection with him and bring him into the world of having relationships with people and talking to them and understanding them and being a part of a community, but Lex just constantly looks down his nose at people who are less intelligent than he is because of how they treat him. And we see how much of a trigger that is for him as well, because at one point Lex misreads Clark Kent's expression when he's exposed to kryptonite and is feeling weak and in pain. The fear of that as a fear towards him as he's trying to punch a wormhole through into space, and show Clark just how intellectual and genius he is. And so suddenly, from Lex's perspective, the one friend who he can count on to see his works and his genius and his brilliance and not condemn him for it is doing that, and that completely sets him off. And it also just happens to be the same experiment which literally blows up and burns his hair off and kills his dad. And I think my biggest compliment I can give Superman Birthright is just the through line of characterization throughout the entire story just makes so much logical sense for each character's direction, you know? Like, seeing how Lex goes from that moment and grows up and becomes this businessman in Metropolis with so much power, hell-bent on kind of like dirtying the image of Superman because he's discovered where Superman comes from, and he's had this obsession with extraterrestrials all his life, but mostly just because he wants to be seen and accepted by them as this being of higher intellect, and he wants to finally, as Clark says it, have someone to talk to. And when he realizes that Superman is this alien being, that triggers him again, because the first thing that Superman does upon seeing Lex when they meet as his Superman persona, obviously, is he looks upon Lex with disgust. Maybe not necessarily fear, but, you know, this place from above, you know. Lex Luthor wants to be on the same field as someone, and he's used to being looked up to in a negative way, and now he's being looked down to in a negative way, and he just can't stand that. His ego cannot withstand that. But what I think is so good about this book is the book doesn't necessarily make that tragic, at least not in like the modern sense of, oh, this is a terrible thing that's happening to this person. It's more tragic in the Shakespearean sense of, it's his own ego that's doing this, you know. At any point he can make the choice to be better, and he just doesn't. And you can see like both where the impetus to behave like he does come from, but also the choices he makes, and the choices he could not make, and the fact that he continues to perpetuate his own problems. It makes him such a good villain. Like, Clark is worried about the smartest man in the world putting together that Superman is Clark Kent, because it's really not that crazily difficult to do so, but I think it's Ma Kent, right, who at some point says something along the lines of like, well, you said it yourself. His own ego won't allow him to connect those dots, because he has to believe that the only big thing to come out of Smallville is him. And, you know, I think about the Superman 2025 film that came out this year, and I heard someone complaining that Lex Luthor didn't make the connection that Clark Kent was Superman. And even then I was going, well, yeah, it's because of his fallibility as a character. His ego can't contain the idea that Clark Kent could be Superman, because it would reflect poorly on him. And I think it is something of a feat to be able to take this cartoonish supervillain who's constantly, like, you know, the cartoon genius bad guy who's constantly making these convoluted plots and being failed by the protagonist and stuff, and actually make him a feasible, viable character who makes sense and is actually super intelligent, but it makes sense as to why he would be foiled by someone like Superman at every turn. By the end of this book, Lex Luthor is, you know, invading Metropolis with a illusory fake Kryptonian army to try and convince the world that Superman is evil. And he's also hired some thugs to go around and do some actual physical stuff, so the illusion holds, right? And this sounds like a cartoonish supervillain plot, but the way that we get there actually seems feasible, and it works for the character. Lex Luthor is a megalomaniacal, insane billionaire, but he is so in a way that we can understand how he got there. Lex Luthor's foil isn't necessarily Superman, it's his hatred of Superman and his own ego that has him getting in his own way. If Lex could get past those things, he would be terrifying. But yeah, to swing back around to Superman real quick as well, there are so many things that they do with him in this book that I really love. Like the fact that it's an adoption story, right? Like, when Clark wants to learn more about his heritage and embrace his heritage as this Kryptonian, you have this very real down-to-earth story about, you know, Pa Kent feeling like he's losing his son because his son is trying to embrace his biological heritage, and suddenly Pa Kent feels like he's failed as a father and he can't be part of his son's life anymore, and Clark has to be like, no, you're my dad, I love you, and I'm never going to stop being Clark Kent, I just want to also embrace the part of me that is this Kryptonian being, not that he knows that at the time. And while I'm not adopted, I can only view stories like that from the outside. It felt very grounded, and I've heard from people who are adopted talking about this story and how much it means to them, and I think that's a big tick. That's a big tick. Green tick in a good story box. And it just further humanizes Clark Kent as well. It's also fun how we see that before Clark Kent was Superman, Superman was Clark Kent, as in like Superman's personality was just Clark. And then when he embraces the Superman persona, Clark Kent becomes a disguise. So he starts like changing how he moves, changes his body language, changing how he talks, so that he separates himself from Superman. Because, you know, being Superman, being this alien and this hero and stuff is who he truly is. Although I wouldn't mind reading a story at some point which focuses a little bit more on Clark Kent as a journalist. I feel like that doesn't get touched upon too much. It does in this book, which is nice. But it's always kind of like as just something in the background that he has to deal with while he's actually wanting to go off and be Superman. But there is a nice little thing in here about it, as when he moves to Metropolis and he gets hired by Perry White as a journalist, he's saying that he needs to be at the paper which gets to the news the fastest, because obviously, while he doesn't say this part out loud, he needs to hear about things so that he can go off and do good as Superman as quickly as possible. But we also see how, Lex Luthor reaches out to him for an interview because while he might not want to publicly admit it, yes, he knew Clark Kent and he did grow up in Smallville. So we see how those connections kind of come back into play. And also something I really liked is we see the journalistic integrity of Clark Kent get tested when Perry forces him to write this article about Lex Luthor claiming that Superman is an alien, which obviously Clark does not want to write because it's going to help smear his reputation as Superman, because that's not something he's revealed to the world himself. But in the end he does it because he has to. And I guess if it's going to come from anyone, it might as well come from him. I like how Clark originally tries to argue that it's not news that someone's come up with this theory about where Superman may or may not be from, and then Perry's like, no, but Lex Luthor isn't just someone. He's one of the richest, most powerful, and most intelligent people in the world, and the mere fact that he is making these accusations is news. And I love that. That felt very true to journalism, I guess. I'm not an expert, but you know what I mean. So yeah, it's fun to see Clark Kent settling into his life in Metropolis. Also, this is a story from the early 2000s, so it's fun to see that the height of technology is emails and stuff. There were certain points in this book when I was like, oh, right, of course, this is a slightly older book, right? At one point, Clark is looking at this tablet, which has all this information about Kryptonian history and stuff that came with him in the rocket. And it took me a minute to go, oh, right, they didn't actually have tablets back then like this. At one point, Martha calls it the e-book, and it's kind of like a weird word. It's all capitalized and in bold, and it's like, oh, right, yeah, e-books weren't a thing then, so it's not oh, right, it's an e-book. It's it is the e-book of Kryptonian. It's weird that it's an e-book. I know e-books probably existed in the early 2000s, but they were certainly a fledgling technology. So yeah, it's not important, but I certainly like to be reminded of a historical context in which a story is coming to us. This also is a very post 9/11 story. There's lots of discussion about terrorism, and the story opens with, well, it doesn't open with it, but Superman's debut is dealing with rogue drones which were being deployed across Manhattan. I keep almost calling it Manhattan, Metropolis, to try and counter any terrorist threats. Of course, they then get turned into terrorist threats themselves. It's all just stuff that wouldn't be completely out of the blue for a modern story, but definitely feels like a thing of its time. And I think that also shines through with all of the paranoia shown towards Superman as well, as this alien, this foreign being with so much power that they don't know how to control. Again, that's something that shows up in past and future Superman stories, but the way in which it was written here felt very of its time. Oh, pardon me, I haven't done the camera bit. So yeah, this is the edition that I read, Superman Birthright DC Compact Comics version. It's a nice version of it. Obviously, it's the only version I have, but one thing I will say, because I'm always praising the art, right? And the art looks good. I do like it. It looks nice, don't get me wrong. But it's not like I was gasping. I wasn't fully in love with the art. I don't love the cover. I don't love the way that Superman is portrayed in some of these with the white eyes, and I don't love the amount of skin we see here as well. Sometimes that's closed up a little bit more, and I do tend to prefer that look for Superman. And I think it's more, this might be there are two main artists attributed to this book. I'm guessing it's one on the front and one on the back, and this is the art style that I don't necessarily love so much. I didn't really love how the Kryptonians and Krypton looked in this book. For instance, there was a when we see his ship. I don't love the design of his ship because it just looks so bright and kind of it almost looks like a kid's toy in a way. I'm trying to find a better view of it, but it's also kind of as it should be as an alien structure, I suppose. Kind of hard to wrap your mind around, like. But yeah, there we go. It just kind of looks weird. I don't know. Not my favorite version. But that's not me saying I hated how this book looked or anything. It looked good. It looks serviceable. It looks pretty. I'm glad I own it. But just in terms of like the way some of the characters are drawn, not a huge fan sometimes. Anyway, I think that's all I've really got to say about Superman Birthright. If you can't tell, I loved this story. Probably my favorite Superman origin, as it's kind of supposed to be. But I do love that different ones exist which focus on different aspects of him. I think my earliest was the Man of Steel film, and that's probably going to make some people cringe, but I did quite enjoy that. My earliest in the comics is probably, I believe, New 52 Action Comics did a kind of an origin story, or at least like an early days of Superman story, so I enjoyed that as well, but I think I definitely prefer this. But yeah, that's going to do it from me. Is this the best Superman origin story? I think so, probably. I've already gushed about why, so there you go. If you liked this video, please give it a like, helps the channel, small channel and all that. Subscribe for more, mostly comic reviews at the minute, but I do novel reviews and show reviews and stuff like that as well. There will be a review for Batman The Long Halloween up this Friday, so look forward to that. And yeah, I'm just going to keep reading the very best comics out there and catching up on them, I suppose. I should probably read some like lesser known stuff at some point, just so that I'm not constantly gushing all the time. But yeah, anyway, thanks for checking this out. I'll catch you in whatever I make next.